The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window, watching the early mist roll across the grounds. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the official letter that had arrived just hours before. The words seemed to blur together, but their meaning was crystal clear. Prince William would be deployed on a classified military mission that could last anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Catherine had always known this day might come. Even after William's transition from active military service to his royal duties, certain obligations remained. The crown had specific needs, and sometimes those needs called upon the future king to serve his country in ways that went far beyond ribbon cuttings and state dinners. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were entirely different matters. The castle felt unusually quiet that morning. Even the usual bustle of staff preparing for the day seemed muted, as if everyone sensed the gravity of what was unfolding. Catherine had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to process the reality that her husband would soon be gone for an indefinite period. The mission details were classified, but she knew enough to understand that communication would be severely limited, and his safety could never be guaranteed. William found her there as the sun climbed higher in the sky. His face carried the same mixture of duty and heartbreak that she felt in her own chest. They had been through separations before during their courtship and early marriage, but this was different. They were no longer just young people in love navigating the complexities of royal life. They were parents to 3 young children who depended on both of them for stability and security. George, their eldest at 10 years old, had already begun to understand the weight of his future role. Charlotte, 8, possessed a sensitivity that made her acutely aware when something was troubling her parents, and little Louis, just 5, still believed his father could fix anything in the world. How could they explain to their children that sometimes duty required impossible sacrifices, even from those they loved most? The couple stood together in silence for several minutes, both knowing that once they began discussing the practical arrangements, the reality would become inescapable. William's departure wasn't just a personal matter. As second in line to the throne, his absence would create a significant gap in royal duties. Catherine would need to increase her public engagement substantially, taking on many of William's patronages and commitments while managing her own responsibilities and caring for their children. The palace had already begun coordinating with the Prime Minister's office and military leadership to ensure that William's mission remained completely confidential. The public would be told only that the prince would be taking on an extended series of private royal duties that would limit his public appearances. No one outside a select group of senior officials would know the truth about his deployment. Catherine thought about the countless military families across the country who faced similar separations regularly, often without the resources and support systems available to the royal family. Yet somehow that knowledge didn't make the prospect any less daunting. Love and worry were universal emotions that transcended wealth, status, or circumstance. As morning turned to afternoon, the reality of their situation began to sink in more deeply. William would leave in just 72 hours, 3 days to prepare their children, reorganize their lives, and somehow find the strength to say goodbye without knowing when they would see each other again. The mission could extend beyond its initial time frame, and depending on global circumstances, William might face additional deployments in the future. The couple spent much of that first day walking through their private gardens, away from staff and security, trying to create a bubble of normalcy around themselves. They talked about practical matters, how Catherine would manage the children's schedules, which royal engagements could be postponed or reassigned, and how they would maintain some form of communication, despite the restrictions of William's deployment. But beneath these practical conversations lay deeper fears that neither wanted to voice. What if something happened to William during his mission? What if the separation proved more difficult than either of them anticipated? Their marriage had weathered many storms, but they had never faced anything quite like this extended separation under such uncertain circumstances. Catherine found herself studying William's face more intently than usual, as if trying to memorize every detail. The way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the particular way he held his head when he was thinking deeply about something. These small details suddenly seemed precious in a way they never had before. As evening approached, they received a call from King Charles, who had been briefed on the mission earlier that day. His voice carried the weight of understanding that came from his own decades of royal service and military experience. He assured them that the family would rally around Catherine and the children during William's absence. But they all knew that no amount of support could truly fill the void he would leave behind. The first day of knowing about the deployment was drawing to a close, and Catherine realized that she had already begun the process of preparing herself emotionally for what lay ahead. She was stronger than she had been during their earlier separations, more confident in her role as a mother and a future queen. But she was also more aware of how much they had built together, and consequently how much more there was to lose. That night, as they tucked their children into bed without yet revealing what was coming, Catherine caught William's eye across Louis's bedroom. In that shared glance, she saw the same mixture of love, determination, and heartbreak that she felt in her own heart. Tomorrow they would begin the process of preparing their children for their father's departure. But tonight they still had the luxury of normalcy, even if it was borrowed time. The second day dawned gray and overcast, matching the heavy mood that had settled over Kensington Palace. Catherine woke before dawn, having spent another restless night, and found William already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling with the same troubled expression she had worn for hours. They both knew that today would be one of the most difficult days of their marriage, the day they would tell their children that their father was going away. Breakfast in the family quarters felt different than usual. The children chattered about their upcoming school activities and weekend plans, blissfully unaware that their world was about to shift dramatically. George mentioned a football match he was excited about. Charlotte talked about an art project she was working on, and Louis bounced in his chair, full of his usual morning energy. Catherine and William exchanged glances over their children's heads, both thinking the same thing. How do you explain duty and sacrifice to children who still believe their parents can protect them from everything? After breakfast, William suggested they all go for a walk in the private gardens. It was something they did regularly as a family, but today the familiar routine carried extra weight. As they strolled along the paths they had walked hundreds of times before, William began the conversation they had rehearsed the night before, though no amount of preparation could make it easier. He started by talking about service and duty, concepts the children were already familiar with through their royal upbringing. He explained that sometimes people in their family were called upon to serve their country in special ways, and that he had been asked to take on an important mission that would require him to be away from home for a while. The word "while" hung in the air, deliberately vague because even William didn't know exactly how long he would be gone. George, ever perceptive, was the first to understand the gravity of what his father was saying. His face grew serious, and he asked direct questions about when William would return and whether he would be in danger. William answered as honestly as he could without revealing classified details or unnecessarily frightening his son. Yes, he would be away for several months, possibly longer. No, he couldn't discuss the specifics of his mission. Yes, there were always risks involved in this type of service, but he was well trained and would be careful. Charlotte's response was more emotional. Tears welled up in her eyes as she processed the information, and she moved closer to Catherine, seeking comfort. She asked if this meant they had done something wrong, if this was some kind of punishment. Catherine knelt down to Charlotte's level, explaining that sometimes grown-ups had to make difficult choices not because of anything their children had done, but because they loved their country and wanted to keep everyone safe. Louis, being the youngest, struggled to fully comprehend what was happening. He seemed more confused than upset, asking when Daddy would be home for dinner and whether he could come visit wherever Daddy was going. William picked up his youngest son and held him close, explaining that this trip would be different from their usual family travels, that Daddy wouldn't be able to come home every night or have visitors where he was going. The conversation continued for over an hour as they walked through different parts of the garden. Each child processed the news differently, and both parents found themselves answering the same questions multiple times, trying to provide comfort, while being truthful about the uncertainty they all faced. Catherine watched William with their children and felt her heart breaking not just for herself, but for him. She could see how much it pained him to be the source of his children's distress. Later that afternoon, while the children were with their tutors, Catherine and William met with senior palace staff to discuss the practical arrangements for his absence. Private Secretary Simon Case had prepared detailed briefings on how William's duties would be redistributed, which events Catherine would need to cover, and how they would manage the public narrative around his extended absence. The media strategy was particularly delicate. The palace press office had crafted a statement about William taking on extended private royal duties that would be released after his departure. They had prepared responses to likely questions from journalists, all carefully worded to discourage further inquiry without outright lying to the press. Catherine would need to be prepared for increased scrutiny during William's absence, as royal watchers would inevitably speculate about any changes in her appearance or demeanor. Security arrangements were also being finalized. While Catherine and the children would retain their current protection officers, additional measures would be implemented during William's deployment. The uncertainty about his location and mission created unique security considerations that required coordination between multiple agencies. As evening approached, the family gathered for what they all knew would be their last normal dinner together for many months. The children had spent the afternoon processing their father's news, and the dinner conversation reflected their different coping mechanisms. George asked thoughtful questions about royal duty and military service, clearly trying to understand his father's decision from an intellectual perspective. Charlotte remained quieter than usual, staying close to both her parents throughout the meal. Louis seemed to have accepted the situation with the resilience of childhood, though he made several requests for promises about what they would do when Daddy returned. After dinner, William spent individual time with each of his children. With George, he had a serious conversation about responsibility and looking after his mother and siblings while Daddy was away. George nodded solemnly, understanding that he was being asked to step up in ways that seemed beyond his 10 years. With Charlotte, William focused on reassurance, promising that he would think about her every day and that Mummy would take especially good care of everyone while he was gone. With Louis, the conversation was simpler, but no less meaningful. Full of hugs and promises about all the things they would do together when Daddy came home. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Catherine and William sat in their private sitting room, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of their life together. Tomorrow would be William's last day at home, and they both felt the weight of time slipping away. They talked about their concerns for the children, their fears about the separation, and their hopes for William's safe return. Catherine found herself memorizing small details about the evening. The way the lamplight fell across William's face, the sound of his laugh when she told him a story about something Louis had said earlier, the feeling of his hand in hers as they sat together on their sofa. These moments of ordinary intimacy would have to sustain her through the long months ahead. The final day arrived with an almost cruel brightness, as if the weather was mocking the darkness that had settled over the household. Catherine woke early to find William's side of the bed already empty. She found him in his study, dressed in civilian clothes but with a military duffel bag packed and waiting by the door. The sight of that bag made everything suddenly, undeniably real. They had agreed the night before that the children should go to school as normal. Maintaining routine was important for their emotional stability, and a dramatic departure scene would only make the separation more traumatic for everyone involved. But saying goodbye to each child that morning, knowing it would be months before William saw them again, proved to be one of the most heart-wrenching experiences of their marriage. George, trying to be brave, shook his father's hand formally before dissolving into tears and throwing his arms around William's waist. Charlotte clung to her father for several minutes, making him promise repeatedly that he would stay safe and come home as soon as he could. Louis, still not fully grasping the finality of the situation, cheerfully told his daddy to have a good day at work and asked if he would be home in time for their bedtime story. After the children left for school, the palace felt eerily quiet. Catherine and William had a few hours alone together before his departure, time that felt both precious and insufficient. They walked through their private apartments, touching familiar objects and sharing memories associated with different rooms. In the nursery where they had cared for each of their babies, in the sitting room where they had spent countless evenings planning their future, in the garden where they had celebrated family milestones and weathered personal storms together. Around midday, King Charles arrived for a private farewell with his son. The meeting lasted nearly an hour, and when both men emerged from William's study, Catherine could see that the conversation had been emotional for both of them. Charles had served in the military himself and understood the unique burden of royal duty that sometimes required personal sacrifice. But saying goodbye to his eldest son, knowing the risks involved in his mission, clearly affected the king deeply. The final hours passed too quickly. William's security detail arrived to brief him on departure protocols, and palace staff made final preparations for his absence. Catherine tried to stay busy, reviewing her own schedule for the coming weeks and ensuring that the children's routines would continue smoothly. But her attention kept drifting to William as he moved through their home, touching base with staff members and making last-minute arrangements. Late in the afternoon, they received an encrypted communication confirming William's departure time and location. The security requirements meant that even Catherine couldn't know exactly where he was going or how he would travel there. This additional layer of separation, not just physical but informational, added another dimension to their goodbye. As the departure time approached, Catherine found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected. Anger mixed with pride, fear combined with admiration, and underneath it all a deep sadness that seemed to settle in her chest like a physical weight. She was proud of William's commitment to duty, but she was also furious at the timing, at the secrecy, at the way royal obligation could still reach into their private lives and tear their family apart. The actual moment of departure was deliberately low-key. No formal ceremonies, no photographers, no official send-off. William's protection officers arrived in unmarked vehicles, and the transfer was designed to look like any other routine royal movement. Catherine accompanied him to the private entrance they always used for personal travel, the same door they had passed through for countless family outings and private appointments. Their final conversation was surprisingly brief. After days of talking through practical arrangements and emotional preparations, they found themselves with little left to say. William held Catherine close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. She closed her eyes and tried to memorize the sensation of being in his arms, the security and comfort that his presence had provided for over a decade of marriage. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes. William cupped Catherine's face in his hands and told her how much he loved her, how proud he was of her strength, and how much he would miss her every single day. Catherine struggled to find words that could adequately express everything she was feeling, finally settling on a simple declaration of love and a promise to take care of everything at home while he was gone. As William walked toward the waiting vehicle, Catherine watched from the doorway, committing every detail to memory. The way he carried himself with military precision even in civilian clothes, the particular set of his shoulders that she had learned to read over the years, the quick glance back that he gave her just before getting into the car. She raised her hand in a small wave, and he touched his heart with his palm, a private gesture they had developed years earlier as a way of saying "I love you" in public without words. The car pulled away smoothly, disappearing through the palace gates and into London traffic. Catherine stood in the doorway for several minutes after it was gone, processing the reality that William was truly gone. The palace around her felt different already, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people present. When she finally went back inside, Catherine found herself in their bedroom, sitting on William's side of the bed. She picked up his pillow and held it close, catching the faint scent of his cologne. Around the room, small reminders of his presence seemed to mock her with their ordinariness. His reading glasses on the nightstand, a book he had been halfway through, a photograph of the family from their last vacation together. The children would be home from school soon, and Catherine knew she needed to compose herself before facing their questions and their own grief about their father's absence. She had to be strong for them, had to maintain the stability of their home life even as her own world felt fundamentally altered. As afternoon faded into evening, Catherine realized that this was her new reality. Not just the logistics of single parenting or the increased royal duties, but the constant undercurrent of worry about William's safety, the uncertainty about when he might return, and the fundamental loneliness that came from being separated from the person who had been her partner in everything for so many years. That night, as she tucked the children into bed alone for the first time in months, Catherine felt the full weight of what lay ahead. But alongside the sadness and fear, she also felt a quiet determination. William was serving his country because he believed it was the right thing to do, and she would honor that commitment by being the mother and future queen their family and country needed her to be. 3 weeks had passed since William's departure, and Catherine was beginning to understand the true meaning of resilience. The initial shock of his absence had given way to a new routine, but one that required constant adjustment as she navigated the challenges of single parenthood while maintaining her royal duties. The children were adapting in their own ways, each showing different aspects of their personalities as they coped with their father's absence. George had thrown himself into his studies and sports with increased intensity, as if trying to honor his father's advice about responsibility through achievement. Catherine often found him reading military history books or asking detailed questions about royal duty, clearly trying to understand the context of his father's sacrifice. Charlotte had become more clingy, often appearing in Catherine's bedroom in the middle of the night, claiming she couldn't sleep. Catherine had started allowing her daughter to sleep in the large bed with her on particularly difficult nights, understanding that sometimes comfort mattered more than maintaining normal boundaries. During the day, Charlotte shadowed her mother more closely than usual, as if afraid that Catherine might also disappear if she looked away for too long. Louis, with the adaptability of childhood, seemed to have accepted his father's absence as a temporary but manageable situation. He had created an elaborate game where he would call Daddy on his mission using a toy phone, having long conversations about his day and asking when Daddy would come home to play football. Catherine found these imaginary conversations both heartbreaking and somehow comforting, a reminder of the innocent faith children possessed. The palace staff had rallied around the family in ways that touched Catherine deeply. Maria, the children's longtime nanny, had quietly extended her hours and taken on additional responsibilities without being asked. The kitchen staff had started preparing William's favorite foods when they thought Catherine looked particularly sad, small gestures that showed how much the entire household was affected by his absence. Catherine's own royal duties had expanded significantly to cover William's commitments. She found herself attending events she had never handled alone, meeting with organizations that had primarily been William's patronages, and representing the royal family at functions where she had previously stood alongside her husband. The learning curve was steep, but she was surprised to discover new strengths within herself. One particular event stood out as a turning point. Catherine had been scheduled to attend a military charity gala that William had chaired for several years. As she prepared for the evening, she felt the familiar wave of sadness that came with taking on something that had been uniquely his. But when she arrived at the venue and saw the faces of the veterans and their families, something shifted within her. These people understood sacrifice in ways that most civilians never would. Many of the couples in attendance had weathered deployments, separations, and the constant uncertainty that came with military service. As Catherine moved through the crowd, she found herself having conversations that felt more genuine and meaningful than many of her previous royal engagements. She wasn't just fulfilling a duty. She was connecting with people who understood exactly what she was going through. One wife, whose husband had completed 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, approached Catherine during the reception. The woman didn't mention William's absence directly, but she squeezed Catherine's hand and said simply, "We know it's hard. You're doing beautifully." The kindness in those words, coming from someone who truly understood, moved Catherine to tears that she barely managed to hold back until she was back in her car. The media had begun to notice subtle changes in Catherine's public appearances. Royal correspondents commented on her increased confidence, her more substantial speaking roles at events, and the way she seemed to be stepping more fully into her role as a future queen. What they couldn't see was the personal cost of this growth, the exhaustion that came from being constantly on for her children and the public, the loneliness that settled over her during quiet moments, and the constant worry about William's safety. Communication with William was limited and sporadic. They had been warned that messages might be delayed or impossible, depending on his location and mission requirements. When communications did come through, they were brief and necessarily vague. William would ask about the children's schoolwork. Catherine would update him on their daily routines, and they would exchange careful words of love and encouragement. But these conversations, precious as they were, often left Catherine feeling more lonely than before, highlighting the distance between them rather than bridging it. The first major challenge came when Lewis developed a high fever that spiked to dangerous levels late one evening. Catherine found herself in the emergency room at midnight, holding her youngest son while doctors ran tests and administered treatment. In that moment, surrounded by the sterile white walls of the hospital, she felt William's absence more acutely than ever before. This was when she needed her partner most, when the weight of making medical decisions and providing comfort to a frightened child felt overwhelming for one person to bear alone. Lewis recovered fully after 2 days, but the experience shook Catherine more than she had expected. She realized that she had been subconsciously depending on the idea that if something truly serious happened, she could somehow reach William. The hospital incident forced her to accept that she was truly on her own for whatever came next, and that realization was both terrifying and, ultimately, empowering. King Charles had been a steady source of support during these weeks, calling regularly to check on the children and offering practical help whenever needed. But Catherine could see that he too was struggling with William's absence. During one of their weekly dinners at Windsor, she caught the king staring at William's empty chair with an expression of deep sadness. The weight of royal duty was something Charles understood better than anyone, but that understanding didn't make it easier to watch his son pay the price for that duty. As the 4th week of William's deployment began, Catherine felt as though she had passed through some kind of invisible barrier. The initial crisis of his departure had given way to a new normal that she was learning to navigate with increasing confidence. She was proud of how the children were adapting, grateful for the support system that surrounded them, and surprised by her own resilience in the face of challenges she had never imagined facing alone. But underneath, this growing strength was an undercurrent of constant anxiety about William's well-being and uncertainty about when their family would be whole again. Catherine had learned to compartmentalize these feelings, to function effectively despite them, but they were always present, coloring every moment of every day with the knowledge that the person she loved most was in danger and beyond her reach. Late at night, after the children were asleep and the palace had settled into quiet, Catherine would sit in their bedroom and write in a journal she had started keeping for William. She wrote about the children's daily adventures, about funny things Lewis had said, about Charlotte's artwork, about George's growing maturity. She described her own experiences taking on his duties, the people she met who asked about him, the ways their family was managing in his absence. Writing these letters that might never be sent became a way of maintaining connection with William, of preserving the details of their life that she wanted to share with him when he returned. It was also a way of processing her own emotions, of acknowledging the difficulty of her situation, while focusing on the love and hope that would sustain her through the months ahead. 2 months into William's deployment, Catherine received news that would test every ounce of strength she had built up during his absence. She was in the middle of reviewing briefing notes for an upcoming state visit when her private secretary knocked on her study door with an urgent message. The communication was brief and coded, but its meaning was clear. William's mission had encountered complications, and his return would be delayed indefinitely. The message contained no details about what kind of complications or where William might be, only that the mission parameters had changed, and that further communication would be even more limited than before. Catherine stared at the encrypted text on her secure phone, reading it multiple times as if the words might somehow change their meaning. She had been preparing herself for a lengthy separation, but the word indefinitely opened up a chasm of uncertainty that she hadn't been ready to face. Her first instinct was to call King Charles, but she stopped herself, realizing that she needed to process this news privately before sharing it with anyone else, even family. Catherine walked to her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed she now slept in alone, feeling the familiar wave of loneliness that had become her constant companion. But this time the loneliness was accompanied by something new, a deep, primal fear that she might have said goodbye to William for the last time without knowing it. The children were at school, which gave her several hours to compose herself before facing them with this latest development. Catherine knew she couldn't share the full truth about the mission complications. The children were already struggling with their father's absence, and adding uncertainty about when he might return would only make things worse. But she also knew that children were perceptive. and they would sense if something had changed about their father's situation. She spent the afternoon walking through Kensington Gardens, needing physical movement to process the emotional turbulence she felt. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn, and she found herself thinking about how much the world had changed since William's departure. The children had grown taller, their faces had lost some of the roundness of early childhood, and she had developed new lines around her eyes from the stress of the separation. Time was moving forward, but their family remained suspended in this state of waiting. That evening, Catherine faced one of her most challenging moments as a parent. During dinner, George asked casually when Daddy would be coming home, mentioning that he had been counting days on his calendar and wondering if they had heard anything new. Charlotte immediately picked up on the question, adding that she had been making a special art project to show Daddy when he returned. Louis, not wanting to be left out, announced that he had been practicing his football skills to show Daddy his improvements. Catherine looked at their hopeful, trusting faces and made a decision that felt both protective and heartbreaking. She told them that Daddy's important work was taking longer than expected, but that he was safe and thinking about them every day. She suggested they work together on a special surprise for when he did return, something that would show him how much they had grown and learned during his absence. The children embraced this idea enthusiastically, their natural optimism helping to carry them past the disappointment of delayed reunion. Later that night, after putting the children to bed, Catherine called King Charles to share the news about William's mission extension. The king's response was measured and supportive, but she could hear the strain in his voice. They discussed the practical implications. Catherine's royal duties would need to continue at their expanded level. The children's schedules would need further adjustment, and the palace's public messaging about William's absence would require careful management to avoid speculation. King Charles offered to increase his own involvement with the children, suggesting more frequent visits and perhaps a weekend at Balmoral to give Catherine a brief respite. She accepted gratefully, recognizing that she needed support but also understanding that maintaining strong family connections during William's absence was crucial for everyone's emotional well-being. The next few days brought a series of challenges that seemed designed to test Catherine's resilience. Charlotte came down with the flu and needed constant care, missing a week of school and requiring round-the-clock attention. George had a difficult incident at school involving older boys who had made comments about his father's absence, leading to a confrontation that resulted in disciplinary action. Louis began having nightmares and started asking repeatedly when Daddy was coming home, becoming increasingly agitated when he couldn't get a definitive answer. Managing these crises while maintaining her public duties required Catherine to draw on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She found herself waking before dawn to prepare for royal engagements, then rushing back to comfort sick children, help with homework, and provide the emotional stability that their disrupted family needed. The exhaustion was both physical and emotional, a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to address. But alongside the exhaustion came a growing sense of her own capabilities. Catherine realized that she was successfully managing responsibilities that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. She was making decisions about the children's welfare, representing the crown at important functions, and maintaining family stability during an extraordinary period of stress. The woman she was becoming during William's absence was stronger and more confident than she had ever been before. The palace staff noticed the changes in Catherine as well. Her instructions became more decisive, her management of household affairs more efficient, and her approach to royal duties more authoritative. Maria, the nanny, commented privately that Catherine had developed what she called the eyes of a queen and a particular way of assessing situations and making decisions that seemed to come from a deeper place of authority than she had shown before. One particularly significant moment came during a private audience with the Prime Minister, who had requested an update on various royal patronages and upcoming state functions. For the first time, Catherine found herself discussing matters of state without William present, offering her own perspectives on policy issues and royal involvement in government initiatives. The Prime Minister treated her as a senior member of the royal family in her own right, seeking her opinions rather than simply briefing her on decisions already made. As the third month of William's deployment began, Catherine received another limited communication that offered slight reassurance. The message confirmed that William was safe but provided no timeline for his return or resolution of the mission complications. However, it did include a brief personal note expressing his love for her and the children, and his pride in how they were managing during his absence. Reading those few personal words, Catherine felt a complex mixture of relief, longing, and determination. Relief that William was alive and thinking of them, longing for the day when they would be reunited as a family, and determination to continue being worthy of his pride and trust. She had changed during his absence, grown into a role and level of responsibility she had never sought but now carried with increasing confidence. That night, as she updated her journal for William, Catherine wrote about her growing understanding of the true cost and meaning of royal duty. She had always known intellectually that service to the crown required sacrifice, but living that reality had given her a deeper appreciation for the weight of the obligations they would both carry throughout their lives. More importantly, she had discovered that she was capable of bearing that weight even when carrying it alone. 4 months into William's deployment, Catherine's life had settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. The initial crisis of his departure had given way to a new kind of normal, one where she carried the full weight of their family's responsibilities while maintaining a brave face for the world. But beneath this carefully constructed stability, she was fighting a private battle against the accumulated stress of months of uncertainty and single parenthood. The first crack in her composure came during what should have been a routine royal engagement. Catherine was visiting a children's hospital, something she had done countless times before, when she encountered a young boy whose father was deployed overseas. The child, no older than Louis, asked her earnestly if she knew when his daddy would come home from his important work. The innocent question, so similar to the ones her own children asked daily, hit Catherine with unexpected force. She managed to complete the visit professionally, but found herself crying in the car afterward, the first time she had allowed herself to break down completely since William's departure. Her protection officer, a veteran who had served with the family for years, quietly handed her tissues without comment, understanding that sometimes even the strongest people needed moments of human vulnerability. That evening, Catherine made a decision that surprised even herself. She called her mother, Carol Middleton, and for the first time since William's departure allowed herself to be completely honest about how difficult things had become. The conversation lasted over an hour, with Catherine finally giving voice to fears she had been carrying alone for months. Carol listened without judgment as Catherine described the constant worry about William's safety, the exhaustion of managing everything alone, and the growing concern about how the extended separation was affecting the children. Most importantly, Catherine admitted something she had barely acknowledged to herself. She was angry. Angry at the timing of William's deployment, angry at the secrecy that prevented her from even knowing where he was, and angry at a system that could demand such sacrifices from families who had already given so much. Her mother's response was both practical and emotional. Carol immediately offered to come stay at Kensington Palace for a few weeks, providing additional support with the children and giving Catherine someone to lean on during the most challenging moments. But more than that, she validated Catherine's feelings, reminding her that being strong didn't mean she couldn't feel frustrated or scared or overwhelmed. The conversation marked a turning point in how Catherine approached the remaining uncertainty of William's deployment. She began accepting help more readily, allowing family and staff to share the burden she had been carrying alone. King Charles increased his involvement with the children's activities, taking George to football matches and bringing Charlotte and Louis to Windsor for weekend visits that gave Catherine brief periods of respite. Meanwhile, the children were showing their own signs of strain. George had become increasingly serious, sometimes seeming more like a young adult than a 10-year-old, as he tried to fill the role of man of the house that he believed his father's absence required. Catherine gently but firmly reminded him that he was still a child, that his job was to focus on school and friends, not to worry about taking care of everyone else. Charlotte's artistic output had taken on themes of separation and reunion, with drawing after drawing featuring families being reunited after long journeys. Her teachers mentioned that she often seemed distracted in class, and Catherine arranged for additional counseling support to help her daughter process her emotions about her father's absence. Louis, perhaps most heartbreakingly, had begun to forget specific details about his father. One evening, he couldn't remember which bedtime story was William's favorite to read, and the small gap in his memory sent Catherine into another private moment of grief. She started showing the children more photos and videos of William, creating new rituals to keep his presence alive in their daily routines. The palace had become expert at managing public curiosity about William's absence. Royal correspondents had largely accepted the official explanation about extended private duties, though Catherine knew that speculation continued in private circles. Her own public appearances had become the subject of increased scrutiny, with commentators analyzing everything from her choice of clothing to her facial expressions for clues about the royal family's situation. One particularly challenging moment came during a state banquet where Catherine was seated next to a foreign dignitary who inquired directly about William's whereabouts. She handled the question with practiced diplomacy, but the interaction reminded her of how many people were affected by his absence beyond just their immediate family. William's work and presence had ripple effects throughout the Commonwealth and international relations that she was only beginning to fully understand. The 5th month brought unexpected news that initially seemed positive. Catherine received word that William's mission had achieved some of its primary objectives, suggesting that his deployment might be moving toward resolution. However, the message also indicated that final mission parameters were still being determined, meaning his return date remained uncertain. This partial good news created a new kind of emotional challenge. Hope, which Catherine had been carefully managing to protect herself and the children from disappointment, began to creep back into their daily lives. The children started asking more frequently about Daddy coming home, and Catherine found herself torn between wanting to encourage their optimism and needing to protect them from potential disappointment if his return was delayed further. During this period, Catherine received a surprise visit from Sarah, the Duchess of York, who had weathered her own military deployments during her marriage to Prince Andrew. Sarah's visit was unofficial and personal, driven by her understanding of what Catherine was experiencing. They spent an afternoon walking in the private gardens, while Sarah shared insights from her own experiences of royal military separation. Sarah's most valuable advice was about maintaining identity and purpose during extended separation. She warned Catherine against defining herself entirely through William's absence, encouraging her to find meaning and satisfaction in her own accomplishments during this period. This conversation helped Catherine recognize that she had indeed grown significantly during William's deployment, developing skills and confidence that would serve her well regardless of when he returned. As winter approached, Catherine realized that she had been unconsciously assuming William would be home for Christmas. The possibility that he might miss another major family milestone forced her to confront the reality that his mission could extend well into the new year. This realization required another adjustment in how she managed both her own expectations and the children's hopes for reunion. The strength Catherine had built over the months of separation had become real and lasting, but it existed alongside a persistent ache of loneliness and uncertainty. She had learned to carry both simultaneously, the pride in her own resilience and the simple ongoing sadness of missing the person who had been her partner in everything for so many years. 6 months after William's departure, Catherine woke to find snow falling softly outside her bedroom window. Christmas was just 3 weeks away, and she had been dreading this milestone for months. The thought of celebrating their first Christmas without William felt almost unbearable, but she knew she had to find a way to make the holiday meaningful for the children while honoring the absence that would mark every moment of their celebration. The morning brought an unexpected interruption to her melancholy thoughts. Her private secretary appeared at her door with news that would change everything. A secure communication had arrived with information about William's mission status. Catherine's heart raced as she read the brief, coded message. William's deployment was being concluded ahead of schedule. He would be home within the week. The relief that flooded through Catherine was so intense it almost knocked her off her feet. After months of uncertainty, of not knowing if he was safe or when he might return, the simple knowledge that he was coming home felt like the most precious gift she had ever received. But alongside the joy came unexpected anxiety. How would they readjust to being a family again? How much had they all changed during the separation? Would the children remember how to be comfortable with their father after so many months of his absence? Catherine's first instinct was to tell the children immediately, but she stopped herself. William's exact return date was still classified, and she didn't want to raise their hopes only to have them disappointed if plans changed at the last minute. Instead, she decided to wait until she had more specific information about his arrival before sharing the news with George, Charlotte, and Louis. The next 2 days passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Catherine found herself cleaning rooms that were already spotless, rearranging furniture that didn't need rearranging, and making endless small preparations for William's return. The palace staff, who had been informed of the development, moved with renewed energy as they prepared for the prince's homecoming. Finally, Catherine received the specific details she had been waiting for. William would arrive on a Tuesday evening, landing at a private airfield outside London and being transported directly to Kensington Palace. The security arrangements would be minimal to maintain the confidentiality that had surrounded his entire deployment. That Monday evening, Catherine gathered the children after dinner and told them that Daddy would be home the next day. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. George whooped with joy. Charlotte burst into tears of happiness, and Louis simply stared at her for a moment, before asking if this meant Daddy could read him a bedtime story tomorrow night. The children's pure excitement reminded Catherine of everything that had been missing from their lives during William's absence. The next day moved both quickly and slowly. Catherine tried to maintain normal routines for the children, sending them to school as usual, but found herself constantly checking the time and her phone for updates. The children could barely concentrate on their lessons, with teachers reporting that all three seemed distracted and excited about something, though they hadn't shared what. As evening approached, Catherine felt increasingly nervous. She had imagined William's return hundreds of times during his deployment, but now that it was actually happening, she didn't know what to expect. Would they feel like strangers after so many months apart? Would the easy intimacy of their marriage resume immediately? Or would they need time to rebuild the connection that separation had strained? The children were in their pajamas but wide awake when Catherine received the final call. William's car had arrived at the palace gates. She gathered George, Charlotte, and Louis in the main hallway, all of them clustering together as they waited for the sound of the door opening. When William finally walked through the entrance, still dressed in civilian clothes but looking thinner and more weathered than when he had left, the children rushed toward him with cries of "Daddy!" that echoed through the high-ceilinged space. Catherine hung back for a moment, watching as William knelt down to embrace all three children at once, his face buried in their hair as he held them close. The reunion was everything Catherine had dreamed of and somehow different than she had expected. William looked older, marked by experiences he couldn't share, but his smile when he finally looked up at her was exactly the same as the one she had been missing for 6 months. When he stood and moved toward her, Catherine felt suddenly shy, as if she were meeting her husband for the first time. But when William's arms closed around her, everything felt right again. The familiar scent of his skin, the particular way he held her that made her feel completely safe, the sound of his heartbeat against her ear, all of it rushed back as if no time had passed at all. They stood together in their hallway, surrounded by their excited children, and Catherine felt the missing piece of her world click back into place. The first few hours of William's return were chaotic and wonderful. The children had 6 months' worth of stories to share, projects to show, and questions to ask about his time away. Louis had grown so much that William had to look down further than expected to meet his youngest son's eyes. Charlotte had completed dozens of drawings that she had been saving specifically for Daddy's return. George had prepared a detailed report on everything important that had happened while William was gone, approaching the reunion with the same systematic thoroughness that had helped him cope with the separation. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the initial excitement had settled, Catherine and William found themselves alone together for the first time in 6 months. They sat in their bedroom, hands intertwined, both trying to process the reality that the separation was actually over. William shared what he could about his deployment, enough to help Catherine understand what he had been through without violating security requirements. He spoke about the isolation of being unable to communicate freely with home, the constant worry about missing important moments in his children's lives. and the pride he felt when he received updates about how well Catherine had managed everything in his absence. Catherine, in turn, described the woman she had become during his deployment. She told him about the challenges that had seemed impossible at first, but had gradually become manageable, about the strength she had discovered within herself, and about the new understanding she had gained of her own capabilities and role as a future queen. As they talked through the night, both realized that while their love for each other had remained constant, they had both changed during the separation. William had been tested in ways he couldn't fully describe, while Catherine had grown into a level of independence and authority she had never expected to achieve. Rather than driving them apart, these changes seemed to have made them more complete individuals and potentially stronger partners. The first week of William's return was a careful dance of readjustment. The children clung to him constantly, as if afraid he might disappear again if they looked away. Catherine found herself watching him during ordinary moments, eating breakfast, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories, with a profound gratitude for the simple gift of his presence. Christmas, when it finally arrived, felt like a celebration, not just of the holiday but of their family's survival through the most difficult period they had ever faced. As Catherine watched William playing with the children around the Christmas tree, she reflected on everything they had endured and overcome. The deployment that had once seemed like it might break their family had instead revealed reserves of strength none of them had known they possessed. Catherine had discovered her own capacity for leadership and resilience. The children had learned that love could endure separation, and William had fulfilled his duty to crown and country, while holding on to the relationships that mattered most to him. Their love story had always been one of duty balanced with personal happiness. But the 6-month separation had tested that balance in ways they had never imagined. Coming through it together, changed but unbroken, felt like the most profound accomplishment of their marriage. They were still the same people who had fallen in love years earlier, but they were also stronger, more independent, and more deeply appreciative of what they meant to each other and their children.